If it's Friday, power, pressure, and peril. Donald Trump's lawyer has to testify before a grand jury in Washington as the former president warns now of, quote, potential death and destruction if he's indicted by a grand jury in Manhattan. Plus, U.S. forces have to launch retaliatory airstrikes against Iran-backed targets in Syria, just after a pair of Iranian strikes on U.S. troops, including a drone attack that killed an American contractor and injured 5 U.S. service members. And U.S. officials say President Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have made a deal on asylum seekers as both leaders face a surge in migrants, not a lot of cooperation from Mexico, and escalating political pressure to manage the issue. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting in Washington, where today a federal grand jury has now heard testimony from an attorney for Donald Trump after a judge ruled that the special counsel's office investigating the former president's mishandling of classified information had presented sufficient evidence to establish that Trump may have committed a crime using his attorneys to do it. It comes as the former president is lashing out about a different criminal case, that one in Manhattan. It's the one where he incorrectly predicted his own arrest earlier this week while calling for protest. NBC News has now learned from law enforcement sources that the FBI and NYPD are now at the scene of what may be a potential crime at the Manhattan DA's office after it found a letter addressed to Alvin Bragg threatening to kill him. The letter also contained white powder that authorities have now deemed non-hazardous. There have been no evacuations or injuries at the DA's office. Overnight, Trump warned of, quote, potential death and destruction. He really used that phrase, folks, if he's charged in that case, which, of course, is tied to hush money payments that he allegedly made to an adult film star in 2016. The former president's 1 a.m. outburst, that's right, middle of the night business, and the reaction we're seeing to it today, caps off for a week where he fully hijacked the political narrative. Folks, the last few days have illustrated the power and influence Trump still has. Sure, it's a less power and influence than he had as president, but it's still enough to essentially mobilize an entire major political party to do his bidding. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has called on his members to investigate and potentially disrupt an ongoing criminal probe. Think about that. Congress getting involved in a local jurisdiction's case with no authority whatsoever. Multiple committee chairs at the behest of Donald Trump have already launched investigations. Even Trump's Republican rivals have rallied around him and lashed out at the Manhattan District Attorney. Of course, they did it because Donald Trump was berating anybody that didn't do it. He successfully bullied Ron DeSantis into doing it. And keep in mind, there's still no indictment. And we don't know if there's ever going to be an indictment. But if there is, we don't know what Donald Trump will be indicted for. There are many unanswered questions about the various investigations Trump is facing. But right now, perhaps the most pressing question is tied to the power Trump demonstrated this week that he still has over his party, our politics, and the rule of law. And the question is what he might decide to do with that power as these criminal cases continue and potentially converge with the walls closing in on him personally. Ken Delaney is outside the federal courthouse where Donald Trump's lawyer had to testify today here in Washington. Vaughn Hilliard is near Donald Trump's Florida compound in Palm Beach County, and Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill. Ken, I'd like to start with you at the federal courthouse because in many, they're trying to figure out what motivates Donald Trump's public lashing out is never an easy thing to do. But he's been losing a lot of hearings in this in his special counsel case, and it seemed like perhaps knowing what's happening here got him to attack the Manhattan DA. So tell us what happened there today.
Yeah, that's a reasonable hypothesis, Chuck, because no client under investigation would be comfortable with their own lawyer coming into a grand jury and having to testify about lawyer-client conversations, some of the most intimate private conversations there are, conversations you believe are protected, and normally they are. But in this case, a judge ruled that the crime fraud exception applies here because the Justice Department was able to show that Donald Trump, there's evidence that Donald Trump used his lawyers to commit a crime. And so Evan Corcoran, one of his lawyers, was brought in today and testified before the grand jury investigating the Mar-a-Lago documents case. And the big picture implications of this is that what it shows is that this case is really as much about obstruction of justice as it is about mishandling classified documents, because the question Jack Smith, the special counsel, is trying to answer is why was the Justice Department lied to? Why did Trump's lawyers assign a document? Evan Corcoran prepared it, Christina Bobb signed it, saying that they had looked and they found no more classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Then 3 months later, the FBI comes and finds more than 100. So that's a really momentous development in this Mar-a-Lago case, and it shows that it's very different from the other examples of classified documents in Joe Biden's house or Mike Pence's house.
So, Ken, and we're going to probably confuse people here a little bit, there are two different federal investigations that Jack Smith is doing. One is what we were just talking about, the classified documents, and that's what Evan Corcoran had to testify to. But there was another ruling today having to do with whether Donald Trump's closest aides, including the former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, would be forced to testify before the grand jury investigating January 6th. And I understand, Ken, we have some developments there.
Yes, this was a secret ruling. It actually came down last week. It's the same judge, interestingly enough. Different grand jury, as you said, different investigation. This is the investigation examining January 6th and looking in part at whether Donald Trump has culpability there. And Jack Smith, same special counsel, wants to talk to a number of top aides, including Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. And Donald Trump had said, no, I'm asserting executive privilege. Well, the judge just ruled that executive privilege does not apply. Those aides have to testify. And we're talking about top national security aides like Robert O'Brien, former DNI John Ratcliffe, top political aides like Dan Scavino, John McEntee. So some very important players in the Trump administration who may or may not have information about Trump's role in January 6th are going to have to go and talk to the special counsel in front of the grand jury because Trump is expected to appeal this ruling, but it's been settled law since Watergate that a criminal investigation overcomes executive privilege. That's why the Supreme Court made Richard Nixon give up the tapes, if you'll remember, because in this case, the government's interest in having this evidence overcomes the president's interest in having executive privilege. And this is the former president, not even the current president, so his hand is even weaker. So another big development and a separate investigation of Donald Trump, Chuck.
You need an entire program to keep up with this and to keep up with the different players, and that's just with the Washington investigations. Ken Delaney in Washington, thank you. Vaughn Hilliard is in Palm Beach County, outside the Donald Trump Mar-a-Lago compound here. And Vaughn Hilliard, is there any crow that they're willingly eating about lying to the public about what was going to happen this week?
No, and Donald Trump is continuing to deliver the messages as he so chooses to do so himself. He is his own spokesperson and perhaps the most accurate one. Donald Trump has continued over the course of the last days to post a flurry of social media posts, including ones that were specifically more direct than any we had seen earlier even this week, when he tweeted protest, protest, protest after suggesting that he was going to be arrested on Tuesday. And there were dozens of folks that came here outside of Mar-a-Lago to stand by him in solidarity. Just this morning alone, he posted on his social media account that there could be potential death and destruction if he were to be charged. He suggested that this is anarchy and the work of the devil. He has suggested that if charges were brought against him, it would make this worse than Russia or China. He equated it, Chuck, to the Gestapo. This is an individual who, on his social media accounts, has gone so far as to attack Alvin Bragg personally. And I just want to, take the folks back to a couple days ago when in one particular post he said, quote, Alvin Bragg should be held accountable for the crime of, quote, interference in a presidential election. Again, held accountable. Donald Trump is going to Waco, Texas tomorrow to hold what is his first formal mega rally of his 2024 presidential campaign. And ultimately, it will be up to a jury, if he were to be indicted, to determine his guilt. But it will be up to American voters to determine whether he ascends to the GOP nomination and potentially the White House again, Chuck.
And do we have any idea? Does he have a theme for his Waco event, or is this just like an old-fashioned rally where, you know, all the greatest hits get played and perhaps he debuts a new attack on either a member of the press, a presidential candidate, or somebody else?
Right. So far, the campaign has tried to orchestrate events that they said were a little bit more tailored. Like when he went to Iowa, the intention was to have it focus on education, which he only gave about maybe 5% of it toward education policy. Yeah. But this is the old-fashioned Donald Trump that we have come to know over the last 7 years. And for Donald Trump, it's clear where his two focuses have been over the course of the last week, and that was on the multiple investigations into him, undercutting investigators' reputations. And then, of course, the second focus for him has been Ron DeSantis and trying to undercut his potential Republican rival. Chuck.
Hey, did the campaign explain why they picked Waco?
There has been no explanation to us at this point, though their spokesman did tell another news outlet that it was in the middle of the state, convenient from all the major markets. Of course, it should not be lost on anybody that this is in the middle of the 30th anniversary since the standoff against the federal agents that resulted in dozens of deaths 30 years ago. And so Donald Trump, of course, is not usually one who is ignorant to messaging or perhaps coincidence. And this comes at a time in which Donald Trump himself is, of course, potentially going to be trying to be in the middle of his own standoff against federal agents as well.
I hear you. The only thing I don't know why he would want to be compared to a cult leader, but I'll maybe just leave that up in the ether. Vaughn Hilliard reporting outside of Mar-a-Lago. Vaughn Hilliard, thanks very much. Let me move over to Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill. Ali, I'm curious what kind of conversations you've had with Republicans who haven't been quoted supporting Donald Trump, and whether any of them have gotten nervous about getting out over their skis and what they did to Alvin Bragg this week.
Look, I've even heard from ones who are publicly supporting him and privately say that they're just kind of utterly exhausted by this, because it has felt like Trump has commanded news cycles before this, but this week really felt like everything old was new again from 2016, 17, 18, and into the years that Trump was in the White House here in Washington. Every conversation that I had with Republican lawmakers, every press conference, whether it was about this explicitly or not, all of it came back to Trump. I think what was fascinating for me is Speaker McCarthy in Orlando at the beginning of the week got very feisty with reporters for asking about Trump and the leverage that he has over this party, despite the fact that he deputized and endorsed 3 of his top committee chairmen to go after Alvin Bragg and ask him to come before them and testify. Of course, that doesn't seem likely. We're waiting to see if they actually escalate that to some kind of subpoena that becomes then harder to ignore. But look, for McCarthy, he is now realizing that defending Donald Trump comes with a price, especially when you have the majority. You can't just defend him and then not face questions about it and have all of us focus on the topics that you want us to talk about, like energy and this so-called Parents' Bill of Rights. That's very much at play here. But I also think of something that Chairman Mike McCall said to me earlier in the week, too, where he said, look, we are exhausted. And frankly, he said that on the record, but even some of the people who have been publicly defending Trump have said that to me privately. They are once again exhausted of the Trump of it all, and we're only just getting started.
So, yet committee chairs sent letters. So if they're so exhausted, I mean, the problem is they say that can be said behind the scenes, but the actions of the party in power in the House make it seem as if everybody is rallying around the former president.
Yeah, but this is also what it was during the Trump years, too, Chuck. How many conversations did you and I have with Republican lawmakers who publicly would stand next to him when he was nominating judges or signing tax cuts, and then privately come back and grumble about how much they disliked working with him and how much they wanted to see him stop doing a lot of the things that he was doing on Twitter and every other platform? This is, again, the same situation. I will say it's immediately entertaining to see people like Chairman Jim Jordan say that he can't see or hasn't seen the latest Trump tweets about death and punishment that you and Vaughn were talking about. And then when one of our reporters said, oh, here, look, I'll show it to you on my phone, he said, oh, I can't read without my glasses. We are very squarely back in the place where we were in during the Trump era of having them respond to tweets that they clearly do not want to respond to and going around and around in circles here as they say, not necessarily that he's the leader of their party, but look, he's one of 3 candidates for Republicans who are running for president right now. He's certainly in the mix in a very heavy heavily favored way.
And also today, Marjorie Taylor Greene led some members of Congress to the D.C. jail to visit with January 6 insurrectionists, people that attacked the United States Capitol, I guess to provide aid and comfort. What was that about?
Yeah, that's about, again, highlighting the ways that Republicans are trying to whitewash what happened on January 6th. I think what's interesting about that is that Democrats, despite the fact that they don't support going to the jail for the reasons that Republicans are going, they went so that they said that they could hold them accountable to the real story of January 6th and why these folks who are in the D.C. jail are in the D.C. jail in the first place. And it also comes after Ashley Babbitt's mother met with Speaker Kevin McCarthy yesterday. McCarthy had previously said that he watched the footage of Ashley Babbitt's shooting here on Capitol Hill on January 6th, said he thought that the cop in that case acted correctly, but Babbitt's mom told our team yesterday that McCarthy said he would go back and revisit that, relook at whether or not he thought the cop acted in the correct fashion. So again, rewriting history here with the power of the majority.
Ali Vitale, Capitol Hill correspondent for us at the Capitol today. Ali, thank you. Coming up, we've got some exclusive new details on the deadly drone attack on U.S. personnel in Syria after a second coalition base came under fire earlier today. 2 attacks in 24 hours. We'll have that reporting next. Plus, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau are about to hold a joint press conference in Canada's capital city of Ottawa in a few minutes after the 2 leaders had a full day of talks on key issues, including China, the security of North American airspace, and most importantly, for Joe Biden's politics, immigration. We're going to bring you the key moments from the day ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now.
We do not seek conflict with Iran. We don't seek escalation with Iran. But the strikes that we took last night were intended to send a very clear message that we will take the protection of our personnel seriously and that we will respond quickly and decisively if they are threatened.
Welcome back. That was the Pentagon spokesperson briefing reporters this afternoon following a U.S. strike in eastern Syria last night. That was in retaliation to what Iran did. Our airstrikes targeted Iranian-linked facilities in Syria. The U.S. strike happened after a coalition base in Syria was attacked by a suicide drone, an Iranian suicide drone. It killed 1 U.S. contractor, injured 5 U.S. service members, and 1 additional U.S. contractor. And the intelligence community does believe the drone was of Iranian origin. NBC News has since learned that one of the radars used to detect incoming threats to the base was down for maintenance at the time of the attack. Following the U.S. strike, 10 rockets targeted a second coalition base in northeast Syria. Pentagon says that attack resulted in no injuries and no damage to equipment or facilities. Joining me now is NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce. And I'm also joined by the Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, a former commander of Special Ops, Command Central, and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Dan, let's get to this reporting you just learned. Boy, that is really disturbing. I mean, I don't know whether we should feel better that we didn't intercept this drone because our radar was down for maintenance, wasn't there. But why was our radar down for maintenance at this point?
Many questions here.
Yes.
Now, Ryder did say, without kind of addressing it directly, he said that they had a full picture, a full kind of radar picture. But it still begs the question, how did that drone get there? How did this kamikaze drone make it through? That's not supposed to happen. There are many of these kinds of attacks, pretty often, and we don't hear much about them because there are no casualties.
Gotcha.
They're noted, the drone gets knocked out of the air, the rocket doesn't hit the target, and we move on.
Right.
This is a case where this was sort of a successful drone attack, and I think we don't know whether that drone had some special jamming wear on it or some ability to avoid radar. So it's an open question how it made it there.
Is this, it does feel as if the Iranians have gotten emboldened.
Yes.
Particularly against U.S. I mean, look what they're doing with Russia. They're essentially the drone provider, it looks like, for Russia. They seem to be more emboldened here. And at the same time, they're making peace with Saudi Arabia. What is happening here?
I think that Iran has the ability to create real problems for us and for our allies. And this is a case where they feel pressure. The economic sanctions do bite very hard there. And so they act through their proxies to push back. And they have been trying to push U.S. forces out of Iraq for years.
Right.
And they don't want the United States on their border. They don't want U.S. troops on their border.
What is, we immediately retaliated. If we know where these sites are, I mean, it sort of begs the question here, What are we doing here? Like, what is our mission anymore?
So first of all, important to remember, why are U.S. troops there? They were there and remain there to fight ISIS, to keep ISIS back, and working with the Kurds, right?
But helping the Kurds, and I assume helping some of the Free Syria militants, correct?
Yes, focused on ISIS.
Yes.
Now, this is a case, though, where you're right. The Biden administration has a dilemma. How far do you go to push back against this Iranian threat, this Iranian-backed threat, right? And do you escalate yourself into something you don't want and have a possible wider war with Iran? And you heard Ryder trying to straddle the line there, saying, you know, we're going to defend our personnel, but we don't seek a war with Iran. So you see Iran pushing the envelope. And of course, they have restored their diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. Right. And who brokered that?
Right,
China.
And supposedly, Syria and Saudi Arabia are starting, and somehow Russia's brokering this.
Yes. So you see that U.S. influence is not what it was 20 years ago or 15 years ago. Yeah. Things have changed. And we have to accept that that has changed. And the question is, how far do we want to get involved in the Middle East? What are our interests? And I think that's always open to debate. You'll hear Republicans and more hawkish voices on the Hill say that the Biden administration needs to get tougher with Iran.
Yeah, both Lindsey Graham and Mike McCall, one a little more heated rhetoric, both of them coming out sort of the, you know, you would argue sort of that represents that point of view, both thinking we're not doing enough on Iran.
And you know, you even heard hints of this in the intel briefings with the intelligence directors, which is that the Middle East is not going away. As much as we try to focus on the threat from China and the war in Ukraine, Iran is going to keep creating a huge challenge.
I'm also have this memory of a Vice President Biden who gave advice to President Biden to say, the Middle East is never going away. Focus your energies on Asia. And I wonder how much that is being remembered now in a President Biden administration. Anyway, Dan DeLuce, appreciate the reporting there. I want to get more on this, and General Nagata is joining us. And General, in full disclosure, we booked you for something else, and you have unique expertise in what happened over the last 24 hours, given your previous command. So I'd like to know your initial reaction when you heard the news of this Iranian drone attack, and you know, how frequent is this threat to the coalition forces there?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here. This is something that I was once heavily involved in while I was still on active duty. I'm a little out of date. I retired 3 years ago, but I spent a great deal of my career in this part of the world. To answer your question more directly, as far as I am concerned, this kind of threat, whether it manifests itself in an actual attack as it did 24 hours ago, or it's just a constant feature of the environment, makes it precisely that. It is a constant feature of the environment. For any of the Americans and our allies that are operating in this part of the world, whether on the Iraqi side of the border or on the Syrian side of the border, in an effort to continue to keep the ISIS threat at bay, we are inevitably a potential target for actors like Iran. And so when I read about this attack that just recently occurred, I was not surprised at all. It will happen again.
And, you know, General, to remind people, when it comes to ISIS, Iran is just as concerned about ISIS as the United States is. And so what do you make of the intensifying sort of, I don't know what else to call it, but it certainly seems like they're almost trying to pick a fight with U.S. troops?
That is true, although I wouldn't exactly call it pick a fight. What they're trying to do is they're trying to shape our behavior in ways that are less threatening to Iran and thereby more advantageous to Iran. The last thing the Iranians want is a major conflict with us, but they don't like our presence in this part of the world. They don't like the relationships we have with many of the nation states and the populations in this part of the world. And they're antagonistic against us for a whole host of other reasons as well. So when they see an opportunity to harm the United States in this part of the world and they think they can get away with it, they will certainly try.
General, you're somebody, when a mission is outlined, you're asked to lead it, you know what it is. I'm curious, and I know you don't want to wade into politics per se, but do you think this administration needs to clarify what the mission is in Syria these days for U.S. troops?
I'm going to broaden your question a little bit. I think we have I think we have a whole of government challenge here, where I think we both confuse ourselves, we confuse our allies, and to a degree, we even confuse our adversaries about what is it the United States believes it must do in this part of the world. I mean, there's some obvious things. I mean, traditionally, for decades, it's been protecting the free flow of oil from this part of the world because so much of the world's economy still depends on that. We also have very important relationships in this part of the world. On the Arab side, on the Israeli side, many populations, many governments in this world, to one degree or another, depend on the United States. But those are the realities, or what I consider to be the realities, that are too often in conflict with our rhetoric. And in too many cases and in too many places across both Democrat and Republican administrations, we've given the impression that we want to walk away from the United States, or I'm sorry, we want to walk away from the Middle East, or we want to wash our hands of the complexities there because we have other things to do. And no doubt the Russia-China challenges we face are very important. But every time we try to walk away from this part of the world or just create the impression we intend to, we create problems for ourselves.
I can't help but sort of scratch my head on this next development, which is we have Saudi Arabia making peace of sorts, reopening diplomatic relations with Iran, and brokered by China. Now you have Russia trying to broker opening diplomatic relations between Syria and Saudi Arabia. In general, the country that has been begging us to do, arguably, that sort of pushed us to go to Iraq, begged us to go to Syria, is Saudi Arabia. So, it does sort of, I'm confused by our alliances right now. Are you?
I'm not sure I'd say I'm confused about it. I am very concerned about it. I think that all the actors involved in this drama, not just the United States, our allied partners like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Israel, and our adversaries or competitors, such as Iran, such as the substantial Russian presence here. It makes for a very complex environment, rather obviously. But what it has led to, probably not intentionally, but it has led to actions and statements by the United States over a long period of time, crossing several administrations, that have become very difficult for people in the region to interpret accurately. And when people are in doubt, when people are confused, they're going to revert back to what they're afraid of. And I think some of the activities we're seeing in the region is because many actors in the region can't figure out what the United States is trying to do. So they revert to their own mental worst case scenarios, and that's what they base their actions on. And
so basically all the countries you just name-checked there, I would argue, to borrow a political phrase, have decided to triangulate their own alliances, right? They've got, Israel has its own relations with China and Russia that are not necessarily in line with ours. Ditto Saudi Arabia, ditto Egypt, ditto Jordan, I mean, and go down the line. And it sounds like what you're saying is because of this confusion on rhetoric, these countries have decided they had no choice?
Yeah, at the risk of oversimplifying this, I think it's just a fact of human nature that when people are confused by their surroundings and the activities happening around them, they hedge their bets.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing now at the strategic level. We're seeing a lot of hedging of bets by many actors in the region. Now, in some cases, that isn't all that important to American interests, but in some cases it is. And certainly when it comes to a country like Saudi Arabia or a country like Israel, when they start hedging their bets based on their uncertainty about what the United States is trying to do or is willing to do, that is never good for us.
Retired Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, like I said, we booked you. We wanted to talk about the concern about election interference, Russian hackers. They may be back in 2024, but this seemed to be an issue that we're dealing with right now in 2023. So, General, I appreciate you being flexible. Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome.
Up next, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau will be holding a joint press conference in just a few moments after reaching a deal on figuring out a way to turn away some asylum seekers who cross the northern border. We're live in Ottawa with the details. You're watching Meet the President. Welcome back. These are live pictures from Ottawa, Canada, where President Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are about to hold a joint press conference following a day of meetings and an address by President Biden to Canada's parliament. It comes as Biden looks to deepen cooperation with Trudeau on a number of issues, including countering China and its growing influence, modernizing our joint air defense, considering what happened with the spy balloon, and addressing the immigration challenges now that are seeping into our northern border. The two countries have also reached a deal to turn away asylum seekers who cross their borders without authorization. Peter Alexander is in Ottawa. He's on standby for this press conference, so he may have to take a quick seat there. But Peter, I'm obviously, for the domestic audience, most interested in the deal on asylum seekers here, because it does seem as if we have a better working relationship with Canada these days than we do Mexico.
You know, I think you're right. As one of the things that we heard from the two leaders as they spoke before Parliament just a short time ago is this agreement that Canada will now accept an additional 15,000 migrants. Obviously, Canada doesn't have the ability to accept nearly as many as the U.S. does, but the U.S. has been pressuring Canada to try to do more here. And both countries have been pushing one another to try to come to this agreement, as you noted, to try to do more to stop migrants from crossing in either direction through these, not through the ports of entry, but through the forests and through the entries to the other country where there is no actual crossing. There is no formal crossing. Both countries now agreeing that if someone, a migrant, tries to cross from Canada into the U.S., that the U.S. can send them back to Canada, and vice versa. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Chuck, just moments ago announcing that that will go into effect beginning at midnight tonight. So it will begin tomorrow. So that's certainly the backdrop to the conversation. It'll be one of the topics we hear from them when they speak in just moments from now. But there are a series of other issues that both of these countries share, certainly as it relates to China. For the press here in Canada, one of their frustrations is Chinese interference in Canadian elections and in their political system, something that sounds awful familiar to a lot of Americans, I suspect, as well. The modernization of NORAD, given the Chinese balloon that sailed over Canadian land and then across the United States before it was shot down over the Atlantic Ocean, an effort to try to crack down on fentanyl crossing into either of their countries. And, of course, there are topics that both of these more left-leaning leaders agree on, certainly the topic of clean energy, green energy, an effort to try to produce more energy. But there are some frustrations on the Canadian side, obviously, with the United States under President Biden saying that it would not go forward with the Keystone Pipeline, among other energy projects, while just a matter of days ago announcing that in Alaska that President Biden would allow for drilling. The Canadians certainly have concerns of whether or not the rules are being equal for both the U.S. and for Canada as it relates to that. Chuck?
And Peter, who's in worse domestic political shape, Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau? What's your assessment there after watching this?
I think we're going to find out, but from the conversations I'm having here, it looks like they're basically at the same place.
Yeah, it's not easy being a world leader these days, whether it's Canada, America, France, UK, you name it. Anyway, Peter Alexander on the road, our chief White House correspondent on the road in Canada. Thank you. After the break, the power of Trump and a pivotal week in politics. We learned a lot. Panel's next. Welcome back. Spring training is coming to a close for Major League Baseball. We're firmly in the middle of the tune-up period when it comes to the 2024 presidential election. And as observers have done all month in the Grapefruit and Cactus Leagues, we're doing some of our own scouting at this moment. There are three people who are arguably most likely to be elected president in 2024. Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Ron DeSantis. And over the last few days, we've learned more about what to expect from each of them as this race heats up and what sort of candidates they will be in 2024. I think we learned perhaps the most about DeSantis. Joining me now on set is Tolu Olorunnipa, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, Stephanie Shriak, former president of Emily's List and a senior advisor for the Strategic Victory Fund, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch, as well as an NBC News political analyst. Tolu, I start with, I feel like we learned a lot this week about Donald Trump, about Ron DeSantis, and the Republican Party. I could give you what I think I learned, but I'll start with you. What do you feel like you learned this week?
Well, Trump and DeSantis have been on a collision course for quite a long time. They've been kind of on parallel tracks, and this is the week where we see those tracks start to merge, where DeSantis is starting to take off the gloves a little bit, slowly talking about Donald Trump in ways that show that he's willing to take him on, willing to at least broach the idea that he's going to have to contrast his own approach to governing with Trump's approach to governing. And for Trump, he's dealing with his legal issues. He's dealing with the fact that he's potentially going to be indicted here in a few days, and he's trying to rile up his supporters, going back to the same playbook we saw on January 6th, where he's telling people, protest, take to the streets. There's going to be death and destruction. And for DeSantis, this is the kind of thing that will allow him to create a contrast. Now, he has to show that he has to be able to show that contrast and actually get in the ring with Trump and make a clear difference between how he governs and how Trump governed. It's not clear that he's going to do that yet, but he has a clear path to do it at this point.
Steve, what did you learn about the Republican Party this week?
Well, I mean, what's interesting to me, picking up on that point, is that I think this week made Ron DeSantis' job a little easier. Because Donald Trump seems to be re-embracing political violence. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to read the death and destruction comment but to say, like, hey, this is a threat. Sort of, my people might go out and cause this death and destruction.
Have we ever had an example of where he went out, talked about violence on social media,
and then it happened,
and violence happened,
or invoked it in the middle of a presidential debate, calling the Proud Boys to stand by?
I mean, on one hand, what I'm troubled by, I am troubled by weirdly. I don't want to say people are being dismissive of what he's saying, but I almost get the feeling because he says it on Truth Social, people don't take it as seriously.
But people are being dismissive. People have gotten accustomed to this. This is what's a scary moment. I think this is why this is a scary moment. People have become accustomed to this.
We're numb to it.
It's hard to imagine that the Republican Party would have re-embraced Donald Trump when you saw the condemnations that you saw from his most ardent supporters like Kevin McCarthy, like Lindsey Graham, in the aftermath of January 6th. But then Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago. You've seen, you have 50+% of the Republican Party embracing Trump now. But this is why I think it's better for Ron DeSantis. He can be all the things that Republicans want in terms of policy, in terms of war fighting.
He certainly did this on Ukraine.
He's doing that.
I mean, that wasn't a good moment.
But if the contrast is, I'm the guy who's not for violence, it's a pretty good place to be, actually.
So he's going to be the anti-death and destruction candidate?
I think so. I think so.
It's a tough stand to take, I guess. Stephanie, what'd you learn?
Well, I don't know if I've learned much about this Republican Party. Other than they continue to do the same thing I keep seeing them do. Trump screams, I'm a victim. People are going to rise up, and then people start surrounding them again, and the Republicans start falling in line. So I actually think Trump, despite all of, he should have had a terrible week under all normal circumstances, but we don't live in normal circumstances. Instead, we're ending a week where I think he has actually made great gains with Republicans again. DeSantis, I don't think, has had a very good week. His little flip-flop on Ukraine showed that, governors have got to be really careful messing up on foreign policy because that's looked at very closely, and he did. And on top of it, he keeps showing he's the ultra MAGA candidate, but I don't know. I don't know where it's going here.
Look,
they're going to protect Trump.
I believe. I don't know whether he made the job easier or not, and that's the thing. I don't know. I assume the weight of all this will eventually hurt Trump, the accumulation of indictments. But I have to tell you, Tolu, you have to be in awe of his ability to do what he did this week. He hijacked this week. We all knew he was hijacking this week. Many of us said it straight up that he was doing, and it didn't matter. You still had House Republican chairmen who apparently are telling our reporters off the record, this is a little too far. And they wrote the letter anyway.
That's right.
I mean,
exactly right.
He snapped their fingers, and they're still afraid of him.
Yep.
They're still afraid of him.
They're afraid of him because he has voters behind him. It's as simple as that. If you look at the polling, DeSantis seems to be slipping a little bit in the polling. That's part of the reason he's taking the gloves off, because he realizes, according to some of these polls, that Trump is starting to pull away a little bit, and he still has the base of the party behind him. And the power of his voice, the power of his ability to rally that base is what keeps Republicans in line. It's what brings them back when they stray away for a week or two after he does something outrageous. He realizes that he's going to keep that base of support, and he feels very comfortable, and he's trying to rally that base of support and sometimes even incite that base to violence. But it's clear that he feels comfortable that that base isn't going anywhere.
Steve, it just feels like, you can absolutely see he's alienating himself more than ever.
Yeah.
More than ever from the middle of the electorate. And Republicans, it is binary. Yeah. You're either going to have to pick one group of voters or the other. You're not going to be able to win both.
No, I think that's right. If you look at the details of what Ron DeSantis was arguing in that interview this week, he started to make an argument that Donald Trump is a loser. We've seen this. We've seen other people sort of hint at this argument. They've all tried it. But we haven't seen a sustained case that Donald Trump is an electoral loser from somebody who's trying to remain in politics. Usually they say it on their way out of public office. He's saying it as a way to say, look, this guy wasn't effective. You might like what he's proposing. You might like the policies he talks about. he didn't get anything done. I get stuff done in Florida. I think that's likely to be a more effective argument. I think the challenge for Republicans is it is the case that they're afraid of Donald Trump because of his voters, so they don't say anything or they snap to, as you suggest. But it's self-fulfilling. Part of the reason that he has such command over his voters is because elected Republicans don't criticize him when they criticize him to us in private, but say the opposite in public. If there were more momentum behind that kind of critique, I think it could hurt him.
How often, by the way, Steve, how often have you, and I think fairly, when we've talked about, hey, Joe Biden didn't make his case for why we're in Afghanistan, or Joe Biden didn't make his case, or Barack Obama didn't make his case. The point is this, you would say, you got to make your case as to why. So nobody in the Republican Party is willing to make the case why Donald Trump shouldn't be the leader.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
That's the thing. They're afraid to do it. Stephanie, though, instead of just letting you dunk on Trump one more time, Joe Biden's approval numbers are going down. What's your explanation?
I'm sorry?
Joe Biden's approval numbers appear to be going down, not up. And in theory, in some ways, considering the chaos on the Republican side, he should be stronger right now. Well, why isn't he? What's your sense?
It's a really, really good question, but I feel like in a moment where, particularly this week and really starting last week when the thought of the indictments were coming up, you all of a sudden have this rise for a moment of like Trump's taking over the news again. And there's literally like nobody knows what's going on with the Biden administration because there's not that much coverage. And no offense to anybody sitting here.
I know what you mean.
We just can't help ourselves. We've got to talk about Trump. And we talk about Trump, and then we kind of talk about DeSantis, who I actually don't think has, like, I don't think DeSantis has really hit the Trump. Well, Trump's going to beat him up.
Tomorrow's going to be fascinating.
It is going to be very, very
look what he did in his post, just trashing Florida accomplishments.
That's exactly
this
right.
This is a preview.
But I do think the Biden-Harris, challenge is going to continue to be until there's advertising. How do we tell the story of what they've done? And that all changes, but that's a long way away. But it's going to change when people start seeing it. We just might have to pay for it.
One theory I've had here, Tolu, is that basically Joe Biden's, his promise to voters was no more chaos. We're going to bring back normalcy. And anytime things are abnormal, voters get frustrated with him too. Whether it's his fault or not, but it's sort of one of those, Trump, Biden. And it almost like when Trump's in the news, it's bad news for Biden, even though he has nothing to do with it. It's just a thesis I have.
It's a smart take in part because Biden got 81 million votes. And a lot of those people were people that just wanted Trump to go away. They just wanted less chaos. And now when it comes to the Biden administration, there is less chaos around Biden himself and sometimes less attention, less eyeballs, less people knowing what he's doing. But a lot of those people are seeing chaos continue in the form of potential indictments for Trump, in the form of incitement of violence, and the sign that we are still in a polarized time in our country. And it makes it very hard for Biden to say that he's delivered on sort of this hope and change idea of we're going to bring everyone together, even though he's delivered on a number of different policy fronts.
I could argue he's tried to make some, but it's like I think he gets punished for when we're.
I think he gets punished, but I don't think he's done a great job of returning us to normal. I mean, I think he's guilty of. I think he's guilty of a lot of the things that he said he wouldn't do. I mean, you think back to the speech he gave, the Jim Crow condemnation of Mitch McConnell. He's engaged in sort of base politics in the way that other people have in this moment.
But not nearly at the extent.
No, he's not Donald Trump.
Even.
He's not Donald Trump.
Okay, let's just because we say that and people hear that and it's not even close.
But Donald Trump didn't make a promise not to do it. Joe Biden said he's going to change the tone. He hasn't changed the tone.
Steve, Stephanie, Tolu, thank you all. Happy Friday. Still to come, Mideast tensions, mass protests in Israel. My longtime NBC News colleague who covered the region for years is going to join me next because he also has an exciting new project in the works. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Thousands demonstrated again across Israel yesterday, clashing with police over a proposal critics say would weaken the Supreme Court, upend the checks and balances between branches of government, and give the government and Prime Minister Netanyahu just simply too much power. The government is arguing the changes are needed because Israeli courts and non-elected judges have too much sway over the way the country is run. All of this comes as Netanyahu's coalition in parliament this week approved legislation that appears tailor-made to simply protect him personally from corruption charges. The moves by Netanyahu's far-right government are creating increased tensions among Israel's allies. Meeting with Israeli Prime Minister in London today, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak quote, stress the importance of upholding democratic values, according to a spokesperson. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also raised concerns during Netanyahu's visit to Berlin last week. And on Wednesday, the U.S. offered a rare diplomatic rebuke of Israel over changes to Israeli law that would allow new settlements to be built in the West Bank. Joining me now is someone who has covered Israel and the region extensively. It's Martin Fletcher, former NBC News correspondent and Tel Aviv bureau chief. He's also the author of a new book, Teachers, the Ones I Can't Forget, and accompanying it will be an incredible photo exhibit in New York, done in conjunction with the auction house Christie's. But Martin, before I get into your wonderful new project that we're all wanting to celebrate here, my goodness, you know, I don't know if you picked the wrong time to leave or the right time to leave, but my word, the Middle East right now has never seemed more foggy. The picture couldn't be less clear these days. Alliances are being upended all over the place. Do you have a theory of the case of why this is a particularly unstable moment?
To be honest with you, Chuck, I don't. I mean, this is the most extraordinary situation developing in Israel. You know, in preparing for this conversation with you, I called one of my friends in Israel, who is one of the political leaders of the opposition movement. He's been busy bringing people, hundreds of thousands of people out into the streets. And I said to him, so what's actually happening? Because he said to me about a month ago, when I asked him what was going on, he said, you know, Martin, things are going to get worse, then they're going to get much worse, and then they're going to get better. And I asked him, so where are we in that process today? He said, I've got no idea. You know, there is some movement. The protest movement is having some minor success. There were supposed to be 5 or 6 bills presented in Parliament aiming to change the judiciary, to give the government more power over the Supreme Court. So actually only one of those bills is going to be presented next week. And that's the bill to decide who will actually choose the Supreme Court judges. Then the government goes on vacation for a couple of months. So I think we're going to see the pressure turning down a little bit in the next few weeks. But let me just say one, Chuck. The key point now, the only way out of this really for Israel is for the opposition to manage to persuade 3 or 4 members of the governing coalition to vote against those bills. Right. That's where all the pressure is. We're seeing all that drama you've just been showing on the screen of the demonstrations in the streets, but the real movement towards change is going on behind the scenes, trying to persuade members of the Likud, the moderate members of the Likud, some of them, at least 3 or 4, not to vote with the government.
Here's a question I like to ask a lot of my friends who live in Israel or who travel to Israel a lot. Is the current political situation in Israel, is this America's future or America's past?
Well, you know what? There's always a comparison. It's extraordinary between Benjamin Netanyahu and former President Trump. They're both facing the same kinds of issues, criminal accusations. The people listen to them. I mean, it's so similar. I think that if you look at, I don't know how to answer the question, frankly, Chuck. I mean, it's the past and the future.
I don't think there's a right answer. I just hope it being our future is the wrong answer. Let's go to your project, Martin, because it, in some ways, it reinforces the business you and I are in, which is the visual sometimes is more impactful than the written word.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I've written a number of books now since I left NBC6. But I didn't want to write another book. I wanted to use images, freeze frames from reports of mine that I've done about people, about subjects, the people I reported on, who basically I was meeting on the worst days of their lives and reporting, telling their stories. And I wanted to, with this project, not report on them, but create images, digitally altered images that showed who they are and that evoke some kind of a reaction in the viewer. You know, I see them as kind of paintings, you know. Yeah. I'm not telling the viewer what to think. I'm asking the viewer, what do you think of this? And then it became a book, which I hadn't actually intended. But these were, you know, people I met who I learned lessons from. I call the book Teachers, because these are people who I learned from, and they changed me. I mean, I met so many wonderful, wonderful people, extraordinary
Tell me
people.
about the images. Some of them look like they're pieces of art, and some of them look like photographs. Is it like a combination of the two?
Yeah, that's the idea. This one, for instance, is a combination of freeze frames from a story I did about a young Palestinian girl, autistic, blind, who discovered music thanks to a Orthodox Jewish piano teacher in the background here in Jerusalem, changed that girl's life. And you know, I was in the living room with them when they were working together, and it was so moving to see this girl's life changing. So I wrote the book. What can I say?
There it is. And that last little vignette, Martin, is just how you sold the book to a whole bunch of people just now. What a beautiful story you just told there in 30 seconds of that photo. Thank you, Martin, for sharing this. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right. And a big thank you to all for being with us this hour. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. I'll have exclusive interviews with Donald Trump's personal attorney, Joe Tacopina, former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, and the governor of Utah, who just passed a fascinating new law on social media, Spencer Cox.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.